So Tom Calderone, very fun. Tom called me up once in the middle of the night. I remember I was in Detroit at the time. I was living there. He says, "Turn on C-SPAN." I said, why turn on C-SPAN, Tom? Just turn on C-SPAN. Okay. So I turn on C-SPAN, and about 5 minutes in, they're taking phone calls for the director of the Office of Management and Budget. And Tom, this voice comes on asking, "I'm balancing my checkbook. Do I carry the one if I'm..."
Benztown President Dave Chachi Dennis loves radio and all of his radio friends.
Hey, Chachi. Hey, everybody.
Because Chachi loves everybody.
Now, this is a guest that I have been looking so forward to interviewing. Not that I don't look forward to interviewing all of my guests, but I have revered this person's career for such an incredible long time. And I've also been very fortunate over the last year to be able to work alongside of him on a project, which has just been an absolute blast. He is really looked upon as a guru in the industry, certainly the broadcast industry, but as well as now the podcast industry. I'd like to welcome Dave Beasing, the CEO of podcast studio Sound That Brands. To radio people, Dave is probably best known as the creator of the legendary Los Angeles FM rock station, The Sound, and for 12 years as Jacobs Media's senior consultant working with media properties owned by Emmis, iHeart, Audacy, NPR, CBS, MTV, VH1, ABC, Cumulus, and others. Dave, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I'm really excited to do this.
Chachi, it's an honor. I know you supposedly love everybody, but not everybody can get on here. This is quite a trip. Thank you.
You know, and the one person that I refuse to let on, not that I refuse, but now it's become kind of a joke, similar to how Jimmy Kimmel always sends his apologies to Matt Damon. Yeah. I have my apologies to Mike McVeigh. He's wanted on this show, and now it's more of a joke than anything else, but Mike is yet to be on it.
Well, if you ever have him on, I will be first in line to listen. I'll be your first download.
Well, I appreciate that. Tell me a little bit about growing up in Nebraska.
Well, it was a good place to be from, as they say. When I tell people I'm from Nebraska, I usually get one of two reactions. Either it's, "Oh, wow, I've never met anybody from Nebraska before," or it's, "Do you know so-and-so?" Because they figure you must know everybody else that lived there too. Great childhood, no complaints, small town, Falls City, Nebraska, southeast corner. And the cool thing for a budding media guy is that I was halfway between Omaha and Kansas City growing up, that were both in the 70s, really strong radio markets. We had everybody
fantastic
from
radio markets.
Oh my gosh. I mean, maybe not in those years, but not too long previous there were people like, Bruce Vidal and Charlie Tuna, who's from Nebraska, Real Don Steele, all those people came through Nebraska, and a lot of fantastic people in Kansas City too. So I grew up listening to the best of Omaha, Kansas City, and then markets like Lincoln and St. Joseph, Missouri, and Topeka, Kansas, and there was a lot of good radio, local radio in those days. So it was great. My dad was he ran the grain elevator in our little town, Falls City, and a real student of radio himself. He grew up on a farm in the Depression, and they were the first farm within I don't know how many miles that had a radio. And so he really loved the medium from the start and knew how to use it. He watched those early years of radio where entrepreneurs had radio stations to promote their businesses, and learned to do that himself. So he did the farm market report on my local hometown radio station at 5 minutes to 12 every day on his way home for lunch, and really built himself into a personality in that small town to where anybody would see him walking on the street and start a conversation with him because they knew him from the radio. So I learned a lot from him.
No kidding. So it's literally in your blood then. Your father was a broadcaster, and he did that as like a side hustle because he was running the grain elevator?
Yeah, he did it. He learned, he was a sponsor on the radio station, sponsoring the farm reports and things. And he figured out that in a small town radio station with these kids coming from Brown Institute in Minneapolis for their first jobs, they didn't know much about farm prices, what the price of corn was, or butcher hogs, or this or that. So he had the big old clunky teletype at his office. He had to know when to sell on the grain exchange when he was going to unload the stuff that he bought from the farmers. So he knew the prices. He knew what the farmers wanted to know. And so he would rip the wire and do the report each day. Yeah.
What a great story. And so did you grow up like in awe of him and you knew that's what you wanted to do?
Oh, from the start. I mean, I was so young when I had in my room one of his old woolen sack reel-to-reel tape recorders and a little turntable and a microphone and I had my own little radio station going there. And,
that's so cute.
Yeah, yeah. And it was also, as looking back, I think I was a budding program director too, because I had, from my mom, I got these recipe cards and a little recipe box. And for every DJ that I was aware of on the radio, they each had a little card in my file, alphabetically filed. And when they would change stations, they'd cross the street or they'd get a new job or they'd move completely out of the market or whatever. I didn't know it was called the market at the time. I would update like a little LinkedIn file, of radio
people. Kidding.
Yeah. When I was like, 8, 10 years old, and keep track of all these people. Okay, Jimmy O'Neill was on WOW. Now he's on KOIL. And
that's amazing.
Yeah. And he knows Sonny and Cher. He met the Beatles. And so I knew all of this
you
stuff.
Would keep notes about him as well.
Oh, absolutely. I knew every DJ, any DJ that I had come into contact with as a listener had a file had a card in my file.
Oh my gosh! No wonder why
I would plan my lineup, Chachi. I mean, I knew in my hypothetical dream radio station who was doing mornings, who was doing middays, and then I'd have to switch them out with the guy at nights and whatever.
Oh, that is fantastic. I love this story. And so not only were you certainly, very fascinated by broadcasting, but you're also, I think, have an entrepreneurial spirit and this, organizational. I mean, I don't think most kids would go that far to actually, put it all together and organize things along those lines.
And quite an imagination. I remember Mom told me, because even before that started up in my room, I was having little talk shows on the swing on my front porch when I was preschool age. And she said that a neighbor lady called and said, "I'm really concerned about your son because he's sitting on the porch talking to himself." And my mom, bless her heart, she just said, "Don't worry, it's 2:00. He's doing his talk show. He'll be good until about 3. Yeah.
He'll be good till the next commercial break.
Yeah, exactly.
What a story. So you get your first gig at KLIN in Lincoln. And what was that job?
That, the first gig officially was in the hometown station when Dad went out of town, I guess, was the first exposure because he said, "I'm going to a convention next week. You're going to have to do the farm report for me." So I started working there doing that, and then eventually
he let you fill in. I mean, that must have been pretty nerve-wracking, I'm assuming.
So yeah, I'm sure I was squeaking like Bobby Brady for sure. It must have been terrible. But yeah, I started there and then plugging the commercials in the Kansas City Royals games and all that sort of thing. Actually, for a funny story, I'll back up a little. When I was about 10, Dad took me into the radio station and there was a DJ on the air named Don May. And he gave me a tour of the radio station and I was fascinated, over the moon by all of it. And he was a gracious guy to show, Gene's kid around. And years later, as a program director, I took my staff out to dinner and we're just doing small talk before the food comes. We start talking about air names that we've all had, our pseudo names on the radio. And come to find out, he says, one guy says, well, back in Nebraska, I was Don May. And oh my God, you are the DJ that gave me my first tour of a radio station when I was 10 years old. But on the way out the door, Dad said, he'll be back to apply for a job in about 8 years. And I remember thinking, oh God, that sounds like forever, 8 years. So fortunately, he went out of town to a convention and then we cut it in half at about 14. So anyway, from hometown to KLIN in Lincoln, and that was, Lincoln was a big city to me. I was worried about driving in Lincoln, but that was when I was in college. And then one of the guys that I'd worked with around my hometown area bought a station in Missouri, and I was down doing summer fill-ins for him when people went on vacation. And one day he said, hey, next week, nobody to fill in for, but I'm thinking of buying a radio station over in Missouri. I want you to ride along with me, and we'll go over and take a look at it. So we did at a little town called Carrollton, Missouri, and the station is still there. He changed the format and the call letters and everything to KMZU and turned it into a big flame-throwing 110,000 watt country music and farm station in the middle of nowhere, but with billboards all over the countryside, and did those farm market reports for everybody. But on the way back that day, when we're driving back from Missouri, he said, don't go back to school in the fall. I want you to be the general manager of my new radio station. And I'm 18 and a half years old at this point, and I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. The job that I'd like to be offered when I come out of school is to be general manager of this guy's radio station. That'd be okay. So maybe I should just take it now. So I did that. Did it for a year.
In Missouri?
In Missouri, yeah.
And your parents, I'm assuming, were supportive of this. I mean, what an opportunity.
Yeah, they seem to be.
Outside of having to drop out of school.
Yeah, they were okay with it.
Now, are you dropping out of high school, Dave, or are you dropping out of college?
No, that's college. That was college.
Okay, so you're already in college.
That was after first year of college. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
So I did it for a year, and then I realized I was missing out on life as a 19-year-old in a small town where I didn't know anybody. So
how was that experience, though, at 18 years old, and you've got an air staff and a sales staff, I'm sure that, are far your senior. Walk me through just what that was like trying to lead people at that age.
I didn't know what the hell I was doing, of course. But I tried. And the owner was only about a 3-hour car ride away. So he spent a lot of time over there, making sure I didn't get into too much trouble. As far as the staff was concerned, we had a good time. I think that they probably resented a little bit how young and stupid I was, but they seemed to tolerate me because my intentions were good. So we got along okay.
I've got a nerd question for you, but I'm trying to get my arms wrapped around the farm report. And your dad was doing this in the 70s. Was he going into the station, or did he actually have? Okay, so you would actually have to go to the station every day, do the farm report live, or would pre-record it and they would air it back.
Yep.
Okay,
he'd rip the wire and just stop off and do the report. He had I remember there was a giant dresser in his room full of clippings from Boys Life magazine and Plays and Reader's Digest with little jokes. And he saved them all so that he could end each farm report with a joke that day. And that became his trademark. When people would see him on the street, they'd say, "Oh, that one yesterday, that was good." So.
The Beasings are the consummate preppers. You guys are so amazing at prep. It's unbelievable. And now I know where you get it from.
Apparently he taught me
really
that.
Impressive. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So after Missouri, you go back to Lincoln?
Yeah. So I go back to Lincoln, get back in at KLIN, now full-time, great staff there, college town, and state capital, of course. So despite it being a smaller market, it was just a wonderful place to grow up. I resumed college at night, but never graduated. Did news, eventually did morning drive. They stuck me in with, there was a guy who was kind of the voice of sports in Nebraska, very well known and liked. They put me on with him in the mornings because he needed somebody younger that could take some phone calls and keep the show moving quickly and stuff. And we did pretty well together. We really did. So it was great because I had the governor and U.S. senators and Dick Cavett and all the local celebrities and football players and Tom Osborne, the football coach, and Bob Devaney, and while he was still alive and so forth, would come by that radio station. And so I was exposed to quite a cast of characters and kind of learned how to handle talent at a pretty young age. It was fantastic.
And explain to me, I've got so much respect for Nebraska for a couple reasons, but the quality of broadcasters, you mentioned Charlie Tuna, Tracy Johnson went through there, Dan Kiley went through there, Johnny Carson was from Nebraska, got his start there. Did John Ivey? I can't recall. I know Ken
think
Benson.
He went through there. Yeah. I knew I was short on my list. There's more people who went through than who didn't, you know?
It is a who's who of broadcasters, and we actually work with the morning show that I think are phenomenal. Todd and Tyler out of Omaha, but I've just always been so impressed.
Ruled Omaha for years.
Why do you think that is? Do you think that it's kind of this crossroads? You're not too far from. You've got Chicago and Detroit, and just and Omaha is a good sized market. But I'm just always wondered why Lincoln and Omaha and just Nebraska as a whole has been this hub for amazing broadcasters.
I think it's a combination of things, including the geography that you mentioned, in that there isn't a lot there to care about other than Nebraska football and a little bit of the local Nebraska politics and things like that. So your subject matter is very clear. You know what to talk about. You know what people are interested in. That helps. But then also, I think because it's a little bit smaller market in size, you get to experiment and grow and find out who you are. And that might not happen in bigger markets.
Sure. No, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So from Lincoln, you go to Tulsa, to KRMG.
Yeah. Yep. I went to Tulsa, to KRMG. Jerry Tibio recruited me, or I guess I applied, and then he recruited me. He was the general manager at the time for New City Communications in Tulsa back in the AM and FM one of each days. And KRMG was the big AM news talk, MOR actually transitioning to news talk when I got their station. New City was a fantastic company for old timers. They know this. It eventually sold to Cox Broadcasting back in the day. Dick Ferguson was the president of that company, and they were very strategic. In fact, they brought in the research group every year to do a research study at a time. They were in markets like Syracuse, Tulsa, Orlando, Birmingham, Alabama, those mid-sized markets where in the 80s, not a lot of research was being done until New City got there. And they'd do a music test or a perceptual study once a year with the research group and just blow people out of the water because they were playing a nice, tight 400 song country playlist or what have you. And, and it really made a difference. And they were very strategic about it. Very good people. Jerry Tibio, of course, went on to be the president of Creative Resources, which New City helped him launch. He's the brainstorming guru that's still out there and helping sales departments and promotions departments and everybody figure out what to do from a brainstorming standpoint. So I learned a lot from Jerry. Were
you programming there, or were you on air?
I was the program director of KRMG. I would have been, at this point, I guess I'd been back in Lincoln about 6 years. So I was about 25, 26 when I landed there in Tulsa. Great experience. Morning guy named John Erling in the morning. Phenomenal. Taught me so much. He had absolutely no patience. Which was what I needed at the time. But it was also it was great for him on the air because he had no patience with anything in that he was the first guy to get bored if a topic was going on too long. He kept that show moving so quickly. And I heard from him recently on Facebook. It had been probably 20 years since I'd heard from him. And he sent me a message that just said, "Beasing, do you still want me to get in a song before Paul Harvey?" And
that's funny.
Yes, John, nothing would make me happier.
So, at what point, Dave, did you decide to focus your career more on the programming side versus on air? Because I've got this, obviously this visual now of you on the front porch and doing your broadcasts. And so it sounded like you're certainly at the beginning, you wanted to be on air.
I did. And it shifted more towards programming, I think, because that's what I was mostly handed in Tulsa. I started doing some on-air there. In fact, I followed John Erling with a talk show for a couple of hours, and I had come up with, I'd been programming the station for 6 months or a year or something before I went on the air. And so everybody knew me by my real name around the station. And John, with his impatience, he couldn't remember what my stupid air name was going to be. And I had told him it was going to be Dave O'Brien. I was going to be Dave O'Brien. And it would always come out of his mouth as, up next, Ryan O'Brien. Ryan O'Brien is here. And about the third time I answered the phone as a talk show and somebody said, Ryan? I said, yes. So, so that became my air name in Tulsa. I got to be Grand Marshal of the St. Patrick's Day Parade and all of that with a stupid O'Brien made-up last name. What part of Ireland are your O'Briens from? They asked me. I said, Nebraska. Yeah.
City.
Yeah, so anyway, I shifted more towards the programming, I think, because I really got into the strategy there in Tulsa because they were such a strategic company and brilliant people, and I enjoyed that a lot. And I'll tell you the other thing too. I got lots of compliments from people like Jerry about my on-air work, and I think that's part of what got me to Tulsa. But I wasn't really at that age prepared to be myself in a genuine way on the air. I was probably pretty quick on the take and able to talk about the right topics and all of that sort of a thing. But I had not come out of the closet, and I was not happy being who I really was. I didn't let people see that. And so over time, I think looking back, I didn't calculate it at the time this way, but looking back, I think that to have been successful long-term on the air, I was going to need to be genuine day in and day out. And I wasn't quite ready for that.
Yeah. And I think back then it just wasn't really encouraged to be as authentic as it is today. I think that was just a harder line to have to walk. And, you know, we didn't really live our own lives broadcasting as you do today. I think you look back kind of in the that started the change in the 90s and probably the 2000s, but certainly in the 70s and 80s, it was much more of a, you know, you played a character, a role.
Definitely. Yeah. But I had a great time in Tulsa, great city, still have friends there, and it's one of the places, if it weren't for the weather and a few other things, I could see myself living long term. It's a really nice city.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Do you ever see yourself going back to the Midwest?
I've thought about it from time to time, but I don't know. The divide between the coasts and the Midwest just seems to get bigger and bigger these days.
It's interesting because obviously the pandemic has, you know, changed people's lifestyles a lot, not having to go in, as many people working from home. And I know so many people. I was just having a conversation right before this, someone who's looking to move to Texas, but so many people going to Arizona and Nevada and Texas, Nashville, and there's definitely, but there is something to be said. We're both, you know, Los Angeles residents to living here. We have a lot of things. I have a
brother in Texas who keeps trying to talk me into it and tells me what the property values are and all of that. But you know, every morning you wake up and you're in Texas if you live there. That's right. And, you know.
And no disrespect to Texas, but I got you. Yeah, I totally understand. So Tulsa to Detroit, and that would have been definitely would have qualified. I think it was R&R that had the leap of the week.
It was actually.
Was it?
Yes. I think Kevin Carter at R&R at the time dubbed that the leap of the week. Yes.
So you go now to a top 10 market. What do you go to do at LTI to program? I assume?
Program in AC for Viacom. There was this, some of the old timers may recall a group that Viacom owned, included Light FM in New York. That was their big flagship, hugely successful radio station. Bill Figgenshoe was the president of Viacom at the time that I was there. Fig, as he was affectionately known. Light in New York, Light in Chicago. They had properties here in LA, and they eventually transferred me out here, and Detroit, among a couple of other places, but those are the ones they tended to hang on to. They loved AC. And they did a great job with AC, and they were very strategic about it. Bob Cake was the group program director at the time, a brilliant guy, learned a lot from him. And Detroit was a wonderful city. People in Detroit, even though most of them at the time anyway, I know it's a more diverse city now. This was kind of at the bottom. This was the early 90s, kind of at the bottom for them economically. They were very nice. They grew up with each other. They had their cliques, people they'd known since grade school that were their friends, but they were also very welcoming of people from out of town too. And I have great friends still back in Detroit.
I mean, yeah, another amazing, I think, just, Radio Town. Totally. Obviously, Saga is based there in Grosse Pointe. The Jacobs, brothers, some legendary radio stations. And what was it like? Did you feel that pressure going from Tulsa to now a top 10 market all of a sudden?
They asked me, and somebody may want to file this away for an interview in the future because it worked for me. They asked me at the interview for Detroit, would you be worried about jumping in market size so much? And my answer seemed to sway them. I said, same ball game, same different stakes, but same ball game. And really it was. And I found that to be the case working with all size markets, that once I had that strategic viewpoint from Tulsa, where it was your marketing model is target product position promotion. Every year at the strategic meeting, we're going to go over what our target product position promotion is. We're going to look at the new research. We're going to make adjustments. We're all in this together. That sort of strategic approach to things really carried me in any market.
And it probably helped because in Tulsa, the owners really gave you the tools, the research that major market stations did.
True.
And so probably if you weren't working for them, it may have been a harder adjustment, but you were already used to being able to have research, but you had these tools. So it made that transition a bit easier. It wasn't operated like maybe a more typical small market station is today.
Very, very, very true. And Detroit was a great experience also. Terry Wood was the general manager there, and we did some really good radio there. And then Bob Griffith was the general manager for Viacom here in Los Angeles, and they were going to put together the first duopoly. This was, yes. So they were going to own 2 FMs in the same market in Los Angeles. So it was the first duopoly in LA. It was 100.3 and 98.7. And their strategy was they had been doing a pretty decent job on 98.7 with a soft AC station that was giving Coast a bit of a run for its money. They called it Easy Oldies, KXEZ. But they wanted to do hot AC because they saw hot AC starting to happen around the country, and LA didn't really have a hot AC station yet. So their thought was, why don't we move the soft station to 100.3 and put a hot AC on 98.7. And they brought me in to do 100.3. And I remember Bill Figgenshoe telling me, hey, if you get a 2 share, we'll throw you a parade. But this isn't about ratings. You need to run interference on the Neil Diamond, Barbra Streisand side of Coast and K-Big and keep them honest, because we're going to go under them with Elton John and Billy Joel. Got it? Got it. So that was the strategy at the time, and it worked pretty well for a year or two. And then
what year was this, Dave?
93. Yeah. 93. So it was right after. So hot. 100.3 had been sold by Westwood One. It had been pirate radio with Scott Shannon and a couple of other versions of that, and then Viacom bought it from them. And when I first started showing up for work, it was in the old pirate radio studios over in Culver City.
Incredible. I mean, amazing history in that building, obviously. Yeah. And still to this day, that building is still there and still has radio in it, which is pretty cool.
Amazing.
So you come in, it's already a big shift. I know you've been in a major market, but you've pretty much spent your whole life in the Midwest. You've gone from Missouri to Detroit to Tulsa. Now all of a sudden you're in Los Angeles. Tell me a little bit about just how you're feeling. Is that culture shock in and of itself, or are you kind of ready for that change?
I was ready. People said from the Midwest, they said, wow, LA has really changed you. And but I don't think it really did. I just kind of think I found a place I fit in, to tell you the truth. Yeah. No, I loved it from the start, and I found myself a house that was halfway between the radio station and Hollywood, West Hollywood, where the bars and clubs were, and I was a single guy in LA. I was having a good time.
Yeah, I mean, what a great era too, to be a single guy in LA and working at those stations. Now you're going to get thrown. It sounds like your boss was very cool and very calm about it. But I mean, to go up against K-Big and Coast in particular, which is just this gigantic behemoth, which was being programmed by Johnny at the time,
yes.
So legendary programmer and a mentor of mine. Obviously, you've got Kiss in town. Deez is in his heyday at that point, and I mean, this is an incredibly competitive market. Did you feel any of that pressure, or they just really kind of made you feel at ease?
They mostly made me feel at ease. You know how things like that go, and I caution people about this all the time, whether it's later years in Los Angeles, whether it was 97.1 amp radio. We just need to take a bite out of Kiss so that K-Rock can look better in the 1834 ranker. When these sorts of flanker, I mean, there are flankers that are meant to be successful flankers, and then there are flankers that are meant to have some success, but in the early going at least, it's about keeping somebody else away from something, pulling somebody in another direction, and hurting somebody in the ranker. And when you go into that situation, I always tell a program director that's thinking about taking one of those jobs, know that may be the intention for a year or two, but eventually somebody's going to say, why don't we really try to win with this instead of hurt somebody else? So it was great for a couple of years. And then what ended up happening was they moved me over to 98.7 to program Star. And that's when things got really competitive and interesting and a lot of fun for sure.
Sure. Now we're talking like 95, 96.
Yes.
About that. Okay.
Exactly.
So Lilith Fair, Meredith Brooks, Alanis Morissette, all this stuff. Is really
what had happened with that, Chachi, was Randy Lane was at that time the program director on 98.7, who remains a great friend of mine also.
Sure.
Randy, well, I'll get to that in a second, but I'll just say, if you ask your general manager, are things good? I'm buying a house, and you tell him I'm buying a house, that's a death sentence. You're going to don't buy a house, and don't tell your general manager you're buying a house. But what had happened was, 98.7, starting at 98.7, was sailing along, and it was an Elton John, Billy Joel hot AC station at the time. And it was sagging a little bit. And so they brought John Perelli in to do some research. And John always had this funky way of testing all kinds of slivers of music to see what would go together. And sometimes John's recipe would cause people to go, what? You're gonna put the Supremes and the Temptations on a country station, or whatever. And John would say, well, they like it. But anyway, he was brought in to try to find what the right niche was for 98.7 musically. What he came up with was that K-Rock was starting to get long enough in the tooth, and it had listeners grow up with it that knew alternative music, knew U2, knew the Police, and they loved the K-Rock Gold. And they loved some of that. They were ready for Lilith Fair. Lilith hadn't quite happened yet, but they were ready. That softer pop alternative was ready to happen because people had grown up with alternative in markets like Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco. So that was the plan musically, to go that direction. And the research books were shipped to Bob Griffith, our general manager, the week before the presentation was to happen. And everybody from New York, Viacom in New York, was going to fly in for the big presentation. Bob was the only one who had a copy of the research and knew what was going to go down. And Bob saw in there that the clear hole was to do this thing, to shift from Elton John and Billy Joel to U2 and Police kind of hot AC, modern AC, as we ended up calling it. But John Perelli, in his research, had it labeled, the format labeled for internal purposes, alternative AC. And Bob sat me down in his office with Randy Lane, and he said to me, he says, you've been with this company longer here than anybody. Do you think that the guys from New York are going to do alternative AC? I said, they're not going to do alternative anything. He says, you're right. So he called John Perelli, and he said, John, this is clearly the format we need to do. We can't sell alternative AC. And John, without missing a beat, said, I'll reprint the books. It's now modern AC. So
that is a great story.
So we sold
a
it through.
Story.
Yeah, so we sold it
Amazing.
through. Randy sold it through, and he got to move the station that direction. Now, here's the unfortunate part for Randy is that we made that move. Randy made that move and did it well in like about June or July of that year. It would have been maybe 95, maybe 96, and 95. And he had no marketing to support it. And New York said, we don't market in the summer. You'll get your marketing in the fall. So he went from Elton John and Billy Joel without any marketing to support it to U2 and Police. And the ratings tanked. And they had no patience for tanked ratings in New York. So they just said, goodbye, Randy. And they, at Bob Griffith, the general manager, knowing what a hot seat and what a difficult thing that station was, he brought me in and he said, I have very bad news for you. You have to program 98.7.
And you're at 100.3 at this point.
I'm at 100.3, played Neil Diamond and Barbra Streisand, just tried to keep Coast and K-Big on us, right? On the upper end. So yeah, did that for a year. And of course, with the marketing, it kicked in.
Unbelievable. And let's talk really quickly because I love Randy and I've got so much respect for him and he's taught me a lot throughout my career. Yeah, he was dealt a bad hand. Yes. I love to tell the story, but Johnny, as we mentioned, who was running Coast, and I don't think K-Big yet at that time, but Coast at that time. At that point, I know his marketing budget in the 80s was $4 million a year. No joke. And that you could not get away from the Dick Clark television commercials, the Dick Clark bus boards.
Yep.
If you go and you watch Where the Streets Have No Name by U2, and the beginning of that, which is Rick Dees is actually featured in that, his audio, but you'll see downtown LA because they shot that at the top of a building in downtown LA. You'll see a bus go by and you'll see it have a Coast billboard on it. You could not escape it. And
everywhere.
Johnny literally threatened to quit when he was told, in late 80s, early 90s, whenever it was, that they were going to cut his budget from $4 million to $3 million a year. He lost his mind. He's like, there's no way we can win. So I couldn't even imagine having to run a radio station up against, in that era and not have any sort of budget. Number two, marketing budget, that is. And number two, the pressure. I remember when I first got here, I was told that every 10th of a share, so every 10th of a point, was worth $1 million a year.
Yeah.
And that's what it equated to in revenue and billing. And so that pressure, my gosh. So you actually come in and obviously Randy, the format was the right idea. Just Randy was there probably a little too early. He
was asked to do it. It was a matter of timing, whether it had been Randy programming it or anybody else, that he had to launch it a few months before the marketing came. That was his downfall, and it was just too bad. And he had that conversation with the general manager at the time, asking, "Hey, just want to make sure everything's okay because we're putting in a bid on a house." And you never do that.
Oh man, that is, by the way, a total testament to your character. The fact that you admit to that, because I think so many people in this business would just basically take the win and own the win as their own, and not share it with the predecessor. And the fact that you do that speaks a lot.
Thank you, but my gosh, Randy's such a great guy. And then following me, Angela Perelli had been hired by Randy as his music director. So she was the music director for me when I inherited.
So she stayed on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. And of course, what she ended up doing with that station is part of radio history. She just was a phenomenal program director for that station.
So before we leave that, it was you who was responsible for hiring Ryan Seacrest, correct?
Full time. Yeah, exactly. I think Randy had him on weekends or something like that. Yeah, I had him.
So was he in Atlanta? He had already moved to LA, or he was in
was doing kids game shows at that point.
Okay.
And he was on the phone to his agent all the time, trying to get more auditions. He learned a lot from Ryan. That kid was a sponge. I mean, he loved the business side of all of it, as you know. And I always had a policy as a program director that if I was ever driving by the radio station, coming back from dinner or whatever, at night, weekends, that sort of a thing, I would stop in and just just pull in, go to your office and rearrange a stack of papers and then leave, just so that the jock on the air would know that, hey, the boss might stop by at any time, you know. And Ryan was working nights for me at Star 98.7 for, by the way, I remember renegotiating his second year and I had to give him a raise. He was making $55,000 a year. And they just don't know how to negotiate these days, do they? No. So Ryan was on the air, and I catch him looking at papers on my desk, doing a little search around, reading some stuff, figuring out what was going on.
And you come in unexpected. He has no idea, so he's doing a little due diligence.
Yes, yeah. Which at the time peeved me, but he was just a sponge. He was trying to learn everything he possibly could about the business side of the business. And his ambition was incredible and still is, obviously, today. Being from Nebraska, as you mentioned, Johnny Carson being from Nebraska, when I was a kid, I read a book called King of the Night that was a biography of Johnny. And one of the things that really set in for me from reading that book is that Johnny was so obsessed with being famous, with being successful. And I saw that in Ryan too. People sometimes will, out of bitterness mostly, question Ryan's talent. And he clearly is, just because he can't sing or dance or do stand-up, will question his, what does he do? Well, he's phenomenal at what he does. He is a host. He's a fantastic host. But it is true that what sets him apart from some other people who may have similar skill levels is he's so ambitious. He works so hard. And that is something you've got to hand to him. And to people that are successful in this business, that work-life balance is difficult because you've got to really want it.
Yeah, that's interesting you bring that up. I could not agree more. Obviously I didn't work with him, but I met with him a few times because he wanted me to produce his show. This is when he knew he was going to go to do mornings at KISS. And I had this opportunity Paul O'Malley was the general manager at the time, and had an opportunity to either produce for Ryan or to go and learn to program with Johnny Kaye. And I chose the latter. And I always kind of question, was that the right move or the wrong move? But part of what scared me about Ryan was this work ethic that was just absolutely relentless. And I knew if I went down that path, there really isn't a balance. And I would argue today that there probably still isn't a balance in his life between his work and I don't know how someone keeps up that schedule that he does.
Right.
But if you look at Dick Clark, who I got to know a bit through Johnny in my days at Coast, he was incredibly similar. Dick, I remember, had a van that would shuttle him around LA, going to different shoots and different meetings and so forth. And he had a desk in that van, and he was working at that desk. Even when he was in the car going from point A to point B, the guy never really rested. And even when he was on set to shoot commercials, and we would shoot a few different markets at one time because he was not only on in LA, but he was on in San Diego and the AC in Cincinnati and so forth. And so Johnny produced a lot of those spots. And so I'd be on set with him. And in between takes, he was literally multitasking. The guy was literally doing other, cutting deals, whatever he was doing.
Right. And knew the business frontwards and backwards. I had a friend who did the publicity for him and would arrange those morning radio shots when he would come on and say, hey, the American Music Awards are next Tuesday night and here's who we're going to have on. And he'd do those guest shots on the phone. And they said that he knew every program director and every morning show and every morning show producer. When he got his itinerary, he would say, well, what happened to so-and-so in Cleveland? I remember talking to them last time. He's on it.
Amazing. Much like you and your little index cards when you were a kid. He tracked them all, man. He absolutely tracked them all.
You know who else had index cards, by the way, was I heard about this a few years ago, was in the pre-internet, pre-iPhone days, Bill Clinton in Arkansas.
No kidding.
When he'd go to all those rubber chicken dinners in Arkansas as attorney general and then governor and involved in local politics, he had index cards. And so when that night after each dinner, each function that he went to, the Jefferson Jackson Day dinner in whatever town, he would he'd make cards about everybody that he met, and he'd try to remember so that 3 years later he would be handed the itinerary and the guest list of who was going to be at the next function. He'd get out his cards and he'd go, oh yeah, Chachi has a kid who plays baseball. I'm going to bring that up. And he would. He'd say, hey, is your kid still playing baseball? And the effect that has on people.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I had not heard about the index card part, but I had heard that when you interviewed him, I never did personally, but I know a few friends that have gotten to interview him in the past, that you feel like you were the only person in the room, that he is so into that conversation, so absorbed by you that you just can't help but be won over. Even if you don't agree with his politics, you left going, man, I really like that guy.
Yeah, this is how I feel about you right now.
Yeah.
This is
good. So anything else that, any other Ryan wisdom that you learned along the way?
No, that's enough. He's a wonder to behold. He's a force of nature.
No kidding. And he really does transcend the medium. There's a handful of, a Tiger Woods who transcends golf, a LeBron James who transcends basketball. And it's great to see Ryan have the success because he was legitimately Howard was born out of radio. Ryan, I hold him in that ilk. Ryan was and it's, I think, a great thing. He's done a great thing for the medium. And,
he definitely has. And I think in his heart of hearts, he still thinks of himself as a radio person.
Yeah. So you leave Star to go work for Jacobs. How did that come to be?
Well, at Star, let's see, I did that for, I'd done 100.3 and then they moved me over to 98.7 to Star. Did it for a little over a year, I guess. And then we had, what is it they always say in the trades? They had difference of philosophy. Yeah. Philosophical differences,
Philosophical differences.
Yes. And my philosophy was that I should work there. And
Moss and I like to say we were invited to leave.
Exactly. Yeah. So Tom Calderone had been at Jacobs, and Tom later went on to be in charge of music at MTV and eventually became president of VH1 in New York and had a great career with them. But at the time that I knew Tom, he was at WDRE on Long Island, and he had this crazy idea about doing college radio for grown-ups, which became the alternative format. And there were others tinkering with it at the time. But Tom was the guy who brought real programming philosophy to alternative, which before then had been college radio. And he knew that you needed to have a tight playlist and you needed to have imaging and you needed to be consistent. You needed to market yourself. And he applied that science to what had been kind of a sandbox for younger people until then. So I knew Tom through NAB conventions. We used to hang out at NAB conventions. Somehow we got introduced, and once a year we'd kind of stand in the back of the room and make fun of people and do what kids do at the NAB convention. On Friday nights, actually, Tom had this thing where he'd invite one or two of us to come to his hotel room. We'd listen on the other extension while he would call the front desk and order a crib for Larry King, or call everybody that was on McVeigh's AC format panel and tell them that Mike had to cancel the session, or he'd call Pete Rose, who had a talk show at the time, I remember, and pose as an affiliate and just try to keep him on the line a long time, talking about the glory days with the Reds. So it was very fun. Tom called me up once in the middle of the night. I remember I was in Detroit at the time. I was living there, and I get a phone call in the middle of the night, and it's Calderone. He says, turn on C-SPAN. Turn on C-SPAN. I said, why turn on C-SPAN, Tom? Just turn on C-SPAN. Okay. So I turn on C-SPAN, and about 5 minutes in, they're taking phone calls for the director of the Office of Management and Budget. And Tom, this voice comes on asking, I'm balancing my checkbook. Do I carry the one if I'm... So Anyway, Tom Calderon and Tom Langmeyer, too, who went on to do great things at radio. We used to hang out a lot at conventions. Tom introduced me to Fred Jacobs because Tom was consulting alternative, all those edge stations for Jacobs.
Okay.
And I went to dinner with Fred, and the thought was at the time, okay, you did modern AC, you were successful with it. It was the format du jour, as they say. And why don't you consult modern AC as part of Jacobs Media? So that became the plan. We got a few stations, but my big break happened when Calderon got hired by MTV because they needed somebody to do alternative, and they moved me over on that. So
you were with Jacobs for several years. Did you stay here in LA or did you go back to Detroit?
I stayed here in LA. Yeah. 12 years with Fred. Yeah.
Wow. That's a heck of a run. I'm sure you were on the road a fair amount then.
I was. Yeah. And Fred always said, Fred and Paul, his brother Paul runs the business with Fred. We do our annual meeting, kind of the review in December, and I'd fly into Detroit for it. And every year the meeting would start the same way. They'd say, if you didn't live in LA and we lived in Detroit, we'd probably be sick of each other by now. But this is working out really well. Let's keep going.
What did you like about consulting versus programming a station day to day? And what didn't you like?
Drop and fly. You get to drop ideas and fly away. It's great. It's the pigeon theory of consulting. I enjoyed getting to know so many people in so many different situations. You really get to that strategic way of thinking that New City taught me. I got to use it in a different city every week and call the others in between as well. That was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that side of it. And the people too, because I don't mean to be cliche, but at the end of it all, you don't remember the ratings and the promotions you did so much as you remember, wow, that guy, Lyn Barstow in Tulsa was a great guy, or Tommy Mattern in St. Louis, or, I shouldn't go down the list because it's going to get too long. But these are people I'm still in touch with today, and they mean a lot to me.
Did you ever run into resistance? Because sometimes programmers are threatened by consultants. Did that ever happen much along the way?
Oh, yeah. Yes, and jocks are too. I remember in Cincinnati, a midday guy he was the epitome of it. He'd be like, "So, when'd you get in?" "Oh, okay." So in his mind, he's thinking, "What was the first show you heard when you got into town?" And then he'd say, "Well, so how long in town?" "Oh, till Thursday." "What time Thursday?" So, yeah, the programmers would be somewhat intimidated, but you try to set them at ease. And I was a pretty soft touch, I think, as consultants go. My own first experience with a consultant was back in Lincoln. John Lund. We went to dinner one night, and I was so hyped up because I did the morning show and I was a program director and I was, 22 years old. And we all went to dinner with the consultant the night before when he got in town. And I remember dropping him off at his hotel, and he got on the elevator, and as the doors closed to the elevator, he says to me, "Have a good show tomorrow." And so maybe I remembered that, but I was a pretty soft, and when I would get into trouble with the companies that would hire the consultants, if I'd get into trouble, it was probably because I didn't have a heavier hand. I wasn't the type of guy that was going to just come in and as an extension of corporate say, "You will do this." I wasn't a "will do this" and "will do that" guy, because one thing that Fred taught me, frankly, was that if you can get it to be their idea, they're going to execute it so much better, and it's going to be so much more successful if the local program director felt that it came from them. So I wasn't usually the guy that came in and said, "You got to do it this way and this way and this way." I'd try to lead the horse to water and see if they drink. And some of the best ideas I will say that we had out there for Jacobs never went down in history as being Jacobs' ideas, because if you're doing the job the right way, they come from the local people. You just present them with evidence, data, help them understand how things are moving, what you're seeing out there, and they form their own ideas.
That's really great advice. I've gotten to get closer to you over the last year or so, but obviously we talked about how much respect that I have for you, and you're so well liked in the industry. And I think your demeanor is just very cool and calm and collected. Is that something that you think has come later in your life, or have you always just kind of naturally been like that due to your upbringing, or a combination of both?
I think it was my upbringing. Thank you for saying that. I think it was my upbringing. I think my folks were just those solid Midwesterner type people. If anything, we ignored any kind of issues that were happening with our family. We would rather talk about the weather or or Nebraska football, than why mom was crying that day. But not that happened often, but no, I've never been one for conflict, I guess. And so maybe that's it.
Yeah. Well, it's an absolute healthy way to live. Johnny Kaye just told me this morning, we happened to be talking, his name keeps on coming up in this podcast, but he's like, you really need to learn how to compartmentalize and not take, the stresses of work home with you. And, part of why he finally stepped away was just, the pressure became so much, and he felt like it started to impact his health. And
I learned a lot from Johnny, even though my time with Johnny was limited, unlike yours. But there'd be those occasions where I'd see him once every 2 or 3 years or something, and we'd have a great conversation. And I'd end up repeating in my head half of what he said. One of them being, I remember he was very excited one night. I ran into him someplace. He had just renegotiated his deal, and he was exiting Coast, I believe, at the time, and going into a consulting arrangement.
Right.
And it was as consulting arrangements go, it was an extremely lucrative one.
Johnny had a knack for negotiating good deals.
Because the money that was involved in that station, as you mentioned, was huge. And they didn't want the advertisers to think that the guy that had done this was no longer going to be part of the station. And so I think keeping him involved in a very public way, even though he wasn't going to be showing up for work every day, was part of the strategy at the time. And they paid for that. They definitely did. But I remember Johnny saying, Dave, if you act as if you have magic, they will believe that you have magic.
That's such a Johnnyism. I love it.
He probably said it better, but I'm paraphrasing. I think that's what he said.
Yeah.
And it really stuck with me.
So you're at Jacobs for you said 12 years?
Yeah, 12 years.
That's a heck of a run. What made you decide to stop consulting, which you sounded like you were really enjoying, to go back into programming full time at the Sound?
Well, I was, as you said, leaving town almost every week. And it occurred to me that here I was living in arguably the media and pop culture capital of the world, and flying to Tulsa and Des Moines every week and really working there. And kids came along in our lives too. And so I didn't want to be gone as much in the airport as much. So I'd gotten acquainted through a client relationship with Greg Salk, who was Group PD at the time for Bonneville. And they were launching 100.3. They were buying it. Same frequency I'd programmed before. They were taking it at the time from, I guess it was Urban AC. It had been hip hop before. The Beat had been on that frequency for a time. Steve Harvey had been, actually the studios we worked out of were built originally for Steve Harvey. Right
off of Wilshire, right?
Yes, 5900, a tall building right across from
facility,
LACMA.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Greg was interested in having me do AAA. It was going to be AAA, and we eventually morphed it more towards classic rock and had a 10-year run with it.
So you go back now and you are programming day to day. You obviously enjoyed consulting outside of being on the road, it sounded like, but now you've got a family. You want to be closer to home, not on the road as much. But a different set of pressures comes along with programming a station day to day. And so kind of tell me about that transition. You're back now. And I know that it sounded like, at least the first time around, management wasn't super focused on ratings, but there's still a big focus. You've got to make sure that those, and now you're here during PPM because you're going through a transition of diaries into PPM, right? Isn't that all kind of happening at the same time?
And that was what did AAA in for The Sound, as the station we're talking about. KSWD were the call letters here in Los Angeles, owned by Bonneville, eventually acquired by what was Intercom. And then in the CBS acquisition, Intercom, later Audacy, needed to spin something off. They put a couple of stations in a trust and on the market and got the offer that they thought was closest in value for 100.3 and kind of a fire sale to having to divest. So we were gone. But man, we lasted 10 years and I wouldn't have given us that long. AAA is where we started. Then PPM came right away the first year. I think it became currency. The station launched in April or May. It became currency in maybe September of that year, 2008. Right. And AAA was not, we were starting to get some lift in the diaries. It was starting to be very encouraging. And then PPM just was not nice to the format. And then the other thing I think that happened was 2008. You know, we had that major recession, almost depression hit.
Sure.
And Bruce Reese, who was really the father of that station, he wanted to have a AAA in Los Angeles, even though research indicated that it might not be the ideal place for another rock station. He really wanted to do it. And Bruce said, you don't have to get huge ratings because in LA you get a 2 share. You know, we won't have
$20 million. Yeah.
Yeah. We won't have a huge operating budget, but we'll do fine. We'll do very well. And, what ended up happening with 2008, of course, is that a $1 billion market became has never been a $1 billion market again in Los Angeles, the ad market for radio. So,
and you guys had, because you now were no longer part of a cluster, and as you know, most people know that's so important in this day and age. It's very hard to be a standalone and survive without your cluster mates to help.
Very
get
true.
In on
we
on
morphed
the
it from AAA to classic rock, and really went after, I will give Larry Rosen some credit on this, president of Edison Research. Larry does a lot of work. Edison does a lot of work for political polling. They do exit polls, famously. And he's very aware of what goes on in politics with regard to research and strategy. Larry made a very good speech at one of our meetings where he said, I've never understood why radio doesn't do what politics does to try to differentiate and position themselves. And it was music to my ears because what he was talking about, he said, you know, any political focus group begins with 5 minutes of everybody saying, I hate negative ads, you know, where the candidates say all these terrible things about the other candidate. And I hate it. And I'm not going to, you know, well, who'd you vote for? Well, I voted for so-and-so. Why did you vote for so-and-so? And then they tell you, well, because the other guy shut down a factory and the guy lost his insurance and and they repeat the ads, right? They work. They truly do work in a binary choice situation where it's one or the other and sometimes the lesser of evils. But we applied some of that in that we figured it was a 2-horse race for classic rock with KLOS at the time. And we started calling KLOS out on commercials. We counted up how many commercials they ran in a day and came up with all these graphic ways to illustrate how many commercials they had, more than we did.
I remember those promos, by the way, are so good.
It worked. It really did work. It got us on the map in a big way. And then the other thing, and not to kick anybody that isn't on this podcast, but at the time at Cumulus, there were some people in Atlanta who were really trying to micromanage local markets, and a lot of things were slipping through the cracks. We'll put it that way. Mike McVeigh not being one of them. This was not his fault. But the talent was not under a contract at KLOS, and we were able to come in. I had lunch with Uncle Joe Benson, afternoon drive on KLOS on Friday. He started on Monday on the Sound, doing mornings. because they were just ripe for the picking.
Yeah.
So
it's kind of funny that Keith Cunningham has kind of taken a play from your book and has now hired Kevin of Kevin and Bean, who's on KLOS. And,
Well, Keith's another one of those, as you mentioned, former Jacobs guys, really bright and doing a wonderful job. But it was really fun because it was one of those old school head-to-head radio battles, like the Shannon kind of battle, where you were calling people out and having fun with it, and we had a great time.
And it was such a heady, and I mean this in a great way, but it's a heady radio station. I love that about it. What you guys did was just so intellectual, and I felt it just was very well executed.
Thank you. I always told everybody that I wanted that station to be the best written radio station in America. We made the point, and this is what I love about storytelling, which brings me to podcasting today, is that when you can market through a story, when you can do your marketing by telling a great story and let people hear that story and then form their own conclusions, connect the dots, and you don't have to just say, we're the best classic rock station, period. Instead, let them figure out that you really understand classic rock and you really know how to relate it to people and you really know what it means to those people and that you have that in common. And we would find ways to write that into the radio station by telling an incredible story about the Doors posing for a picture in the window of the Morrison Hotel, even though they didn't have permission to go in there and do it, or Crosby, Stills, and Nash posing on the front porch of a house on Santa Monica Boulevard, and then the next day coming back because they wanted to get the seating order right. They realized that was the photo they wanted to use for the album cover for CS&N, but they were in the wrong order, left to right, and so they wanted to take the shot again, but the house had been torn down that very night. Those sorts of stories really resonate with people to where they would hear those songs that they'd heard a million times on the radio, but preceded by a story like that, they listened again for the first time.
We stole that in our libraries, and a few of them, our classic rock library and our AC library, even our Christmas library. We have a behind the song feature where we literally tell stories about individual songs, and it's actually one of our most downloaded elements.
I believe it.
So, Dave, after you left the sound, you really jumped full-time into podcasting and launched a company called Sound That Brands. And just full disclosure, we work closely with you and Rick and the team at Sound That Brands, including Craig Rossi, my former boss when I was programming here at K-Big. So how did it come to be? Tell me about Sound That Brands.
We appreciate working with you very much. We enjoy that. Sound That Brands, it was a pretty natural outgrowth of what I was doing in radio when you think about it, because, salespeople come to your office as a programmer. Salespeople come and they have challenges with brands, with clients. They need ideas. They need proposals. I always encouraged them to come in because I thought, if I can get in on the ground floor of that conversation, I can steer it in whatever direction would fit my brand as well as the client's brand. And the Sound was the kind of station where, a single station. It was not a cluster. It was a standalone. We had a great sales department led by Peter Burton and Marilee Wagner and Kelly Coates. And they were creative, wonderful people who needed to sell creatively. So they would come in and ask those questions. I enjoyed it so much. Maybe that my background in learning brainstorming from Jerry Tibio back in the day. But as far as I was concerned, whether I'm coming up with stories that sell the radio station brand or a client brand, it's kind of the same thing. It's really fun. So when radio was nearing an end for me on a day-to-day basis, I knew that podcasting was where I was going. So the idea came to me of, I was kicking around some different things, talked to Wheezy Kramer about what if I were to do a brainstorm company where I was just not like Jerry teaching brainstorming, but I was actually somebody that you could pull into meetings in the sales department and come up with things. And I received some encouragement on things like that. But what really made sense was to open a studio that can work with brands and develop their audio identities, build some podcasts, and go from there.
I feel like you were really ahead of your time with this. You launched Sound That Brands how many years ago?
Well, it was right after the station ended, so 2018, I guess.
So, I mean, that's pretty impressive. You were definitely ahead of the curve. And to be able to identify that large corporate clients, or don't even have to be a large corporate client, but that companies were going to want to get into the podcast space to really help brand themselves and to reach their fan in a different way was going to be part of where the world was going, I think is really impressive. And give me a little bit of why you think that's important for brands to have a podcast.
As they say, facts tell, stories sell. I've always believed that you can put out all kinds of information and comparative advertising. Sometimes we've been really aggressive about using that back at the Sound and in some of the stations that I still work with in just coming right out and telling stories in a comparative way, but also the stories behind things. The grocer that you're talking about, they've been doing content marketing for years where they explain where they get those coffee beans, or that cheese was aged in a cave in Scotland. And those are great stories, how they come across these products from all over the world and help to develop them. So they're the perfect client for this. But in some cases, brands don't want to be quite so brand-centric in the stories they tell. They want to tell stories that they know are of interest to their customer base and associate themselves with the values and the essence of the brand that those stories depict. So it works really well for them. Our slogan is, be the content, not the interruption. We think that there will always be a place, especially for reach purposes, for interruptive advertising, for commercials that occur in the middle of programming that you want to consume, or as pre-rolls to a video or what have you. But there's also a place for brands to kind of create their own media and tell their own stories. So we're that for them.
Yeah, I think it's amazing, and I find myself gravitating to that kind of programming. I'm a big Disney nut, and I think they do a phenomenal job of really telling us about the new attractions that they're building or the new experiences, or they have a great documentary about their Imagineering department on Disney Plus that I just really loved watching. And in one aspect, it is certainly talking about the brand, and it's about the brand, but I find it A, I learn a lot, which I like, but B, I'm such a fan of Disney. I want to consume it. I want to know more. And it's this fine line of, it's not a commercial, but it's not your regular programming either, if that makes sense.
That's a perfect example. People want to see behind the curtain. I think sometimes in radio, we forgot that, or probably still do in radio, that access to the behind the scenes can be a bigger reward to a listener than tickets to a movie or a dinner out or what have you, or a concert. If they're fans of what you do, not to overestimate or be too egotistical about it, but we take for granted, those of us that work in media, what our days are like. We just recorded a podcast with a physician yesterday, talking about pharmaceuticals, and the treatments that he recommends include a specific pharmaceutical that we're working for. He finished up the recording session, which I thought was kind of a grueling session because we had regulatory lawyers on there saying, "Yeah, you can't say this, you can only say that," and so forth. And it was
always a buzzkill.
Yes, the lawyers and the FDA that they answer to. So it was not a fun session, I will say. It was, it was fine, but it wasn't one of the most fun recording sessions I've ever had. And yet at the end of it, he said, "Wow, now I got to go back to my boring old job," That's to the average person. And you remember in radio when we do the cheap promotion where we'd go take coffee mugs and stuff and some donuts out to some office at 10 in the morning with the morning show once a week. And you would leave these people behind who were filing stuff in some basement, and you had just made their year because a small piece of your radio station had spent a half hour with them. It was really entertaining and fun to be around that atmosphere. So Anyway, I think that seeing behind the scenes, behind the curtain, has a lot of magic for people if they're fans of that product or of that skill set, that industry, that if you're a consumer of that stuff, well, you're curious about the cheese or how the animation happens.
Sure. I think that's really well put, and something that not only is applicable to podcasting, but also radio as well. We've seen podcast growth really explode since you've gotten into the space 5 years ago, especially since the pandemic started. Do you foresee that growth continuing, or do you think it will start to level off a bit?
It's a fad now, but also a trend. And at some point, it's just a trend. But it's going to be a fast-growing medium, even when the newness wears off of it. Of course, some people have been in podcasting even longer than me. A lot of people have. To them, they would say it's not new, but it is. It is still a bit of a novelty to most of the general public.
Sure. I mean, the automobile wasn't really new to Henry Ford, but to most of the United States at that time, it was very, very new. It takes a long time for things to become commonplace.
Very true, and he gets a lot of credit, as he should, even though it had been around before him. So the podcasting will continue to grow. If you break it down, you've seen the Edison research and everybody else doing the charts and graphs on how it's growing, and it is growing quickly. But if you just break it down into common sense, and you think, all right, if I'm a listener, why would I not want to be able to hit play and start a program when I want to start a program, and pause it when I want to pause it, and rewind it and fast forward and all of that, and have it on my phone along with thousands of others that I can consume that are really tailored to me? It's the perfect audio medium for the long tail. We're all familiar with that term from the book that came out years ago about, and it was true, and it's playing out as predicted, that media offerings, entertainment, everything is going through a process of the next big thing not being as big as the big thing before it, because it's all more targeted now. It's all much more narrowly conceived for a specific audience. Podcasting plays into that trend completely, in that you could be a fan of macrame and find the macrame podcast that you love, and that becomes your morning show each day. If you're a macrame fan, you listen to that while you drive to work. Podcasting does that for people. Yeah.
I found myself, I just went up to Vegas for NAB and back, and we drove because we had a bunch of stuff we had to take out there. And I found myself, I'm obviously a radio P1, and I love radio in general, but I probably spent half the drive listening to podcasts, the other half, checking out the dial. And it's definitely becoming more and more of my daily when I'm in the car.
And I think, thinking of that car, these dashboards, as Fred Jacobs keeps reminding all of us from his visits to CES and his relationships in Detroit, the dashboard's becoming a giant screen, is what's happening. You already see smaller screens in newer vehicles, but they're going to stretch from window to window in front of you. As the chores of actually driving become something that the car takes care of more and more, hopefully not to an unsafe degree, the driver will also be able to be distracted somewhat by what's going on entertainment-wise in the car on those screens. I think that podcasting and audio and video, all of these things are going to kind of merge, and radio needs to become visual on that dashboard. We've always joked about people having a face for radio, and I'll include myself. But we're at a point now where radio, video, podcasting, video games, all of these things are going to be merging to where it's all just multimedia stuff that is out there for us. Some of it will play in the car, and some of it will play at home and wherever we choose to consume it. But we've got to, as media people, embrace the future and not think in these narrow silos.
You partnered, I think a couple years ago, with a company that I've got the utmost respect for, Jeff Simoleon and Rick Cummings at Emmis. And how did that relationship start? And explain just why you decided to go down that path.
Like any big business deal, it began over lunch at the smokehouse in Burbank.
That cheese bread makes you do crazy things, man.
Oh, it does, man. Oh, I'm yearning for it right now. Thanks for mentioning it. Rick Cummings is just a mensch. He's anybody who's ever worked for or with or been around Rick Cummings knows that he's one of those people who is so down to earth, so genuinely interested in the people around him. He was, when I left Star 98.7, he reached out to me immediately. I don't think we'd ever met. So this would have been mid-90s. He reached out immediately and said, hey, loved what you did over there. Could we have lunch? And he does that sort of a thing. He just loves to know people and learn from them. And so we've always kept in touch. 2 or 3 times a year, we would go to lunch, usually at the smokehouse. It was one of our regular lunches, and he was telling me what was going on with Emmis, that they were exploring some possible acquisitions. And that didn't even register with me when he mentioned it. He asked me how my business was going with Sound That Brands. And I said, well, it's going good. We're growing, but it's going to take a while because I'm going to have to dip into my 401k here if I really want to promote this and get myself out there and be perceived as something other than a one-man band. And there was a bit of a pause while we munched probably on the cheese bread. And he said, would you be interested in an investor? And next thing you know, he's talking to Jeff and to Pat Walsh and the team in Indianapolis with Emmis about us working together. And it has just been a beautiful relationship. They didn't come in and write a check saying, here's $10 million, go get some office space and studios and hire 100 people. But what they did do was they said, look, you get this into the black, we'll give you some more money. And then you get it into the black again, we'll give you a little more. And we'll help you every step of the way. So it's been fantastic. And because of their support and because of having Rick on the team too, with his common sense outlook on things, we have been able to grow a lot quicker. We just completed a great event. Thank you for coming at the Podcast Movement Evolutions Conference in Los Angeles, where we had a breakfast and brought our clients together and talked about the future of content marketing in audio. And it was a proud moment for me because I was able to look out over that ballroom at the JW Marriott and think, gosh, from the kitchen table to this, major brands sitting in the audience, soaking up this information and interested in doing projects, more projects in some cases than they've already done. And that happened largely because of Emmis.
It was a fantastic event, and Microsoft was in attendance. National Geographic was in attendance. I mean, some really large corporations, all Fortune 500 companies, really impressive audience and a great panel. I learned a lot there. And it's, I think, a fantastic partner for you. Emmis has been great partners to us, certainly on the radio station, and we've worked with them, pretty much from the beginning in, Benztown with imaging and voiceover and a lot of the services that we provide. And I just have so much respect for both Rick and Jeff. I don't know Pat that well, but I've met him a few times. But I think it's just such a well-run organization, and they really lead with their hearts, and they treat people so incredibly well.
They do. I first came to understand that when I was consulting with Jacobs. I was consulting several Emmis stations, and the program director from one of their major market stations, had been let go. It was one of those unfortunate situations where it was a great person, but they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or right place at the wrong time for what needed to be done there. But had everyone's respect on the way out the door. And about 6 months later, I'm talking to that same program director who predictably landed in another great major market job. And they said, I was just talking to Rick Cummings the other day. And I said, really? You're still on good terms with Rick? And he says, absolutely. I'm not going to blow up that relationship. And you see that with Rick. I mean, it was well publicized in the trades that Big Boy's parting from Power 106 when Emmis owned that brand here in Los Angeles was not something that Emmis was happy about. And there was There were some lawyers involved at one point, but Rick's talking to Big Boy and going to lunch with Big Boy, and Woody, who worked for Rick in St. Louis and in Chicago, is a good friend of Rick's, even though he's now with iHeart, which was an Emmis competitor here. He's just good people.
He absolutely is. And the talent that he has helped nurture and discovered, the list goes on and on. He's just incredibly impressive. Well, congratulations on that partnership. Let's go back a little bit into radio. Obviously, I know you're heavy into the podcasting space, but you do still work a little bit on the radio side, and you consult some stations. Fill me in on why you like to continue keeping involved on the radio side of the business.
It's fun. Some people play golf. I get to consult radio stations a little bit.
I do both. Obviously I don't consult, but I work in radio and I play golf, and they can both be equally as frustrating.
Yes, I'm sure. Your plan is to take out the frustrations of one on the other, and it doesn't always work out that way. Probably. I don't market myself as a consultant, and I have very few stations that I work with, but once in a while I'll get an email or a phone call from somebody usually somebody I've worked with in the past, or I was referred by someone. And I'm upfront with them in saying, hey, I'm not the guy who works with 20 other stations in your format and has a whole bunch of cookie cutter stuff to send you. And there is a time and place where that's what you need. If you want somebody who in his spare time will enjoy looking at the unique situation you're in and coming up with some answers for that situation, I love that. And so that's what the radio consulting has been about. And I hope I'm doing more good than harm out there. But it's a lot of fun.
We have another client in common down at Local Media San Diego, and you're working with 91X. And they just made some recent changes. What's going on down there?
Well, Garrett Michaels is a former client of mine at Jacobs, and one of the smartest programmers out there. Definitely kind of goes on the Mount Rushmore of alternative rock radio programmers.
I agree completely, yeah.
Yeah, and Garrett and I take this as a really big compliment in that he likes to use the word collaborate. So I don't really consult Garrett from time to time. I collaborate with Garrett. I love to write for those situations. He tends to have the music side of it down pat. I'll weigh in with an opinion if he asks, but I love that positioning, the imaging, and what they're doing at 91X is something that all of alternative is taking a look at and should. They've basically decided that with a heritage brand there, rather than target the younger end of 2554, to go after some of those original listeners of 91X. Or the second generation even. There have been several generations that have listened to 91X. They're in their 40th year now as an alternative brand in San Diego. There was K-Rock that Rick Carroll programmed, and he was the consultant, and I think Fred had a hand in it too, that helped put on 91X as an alternative station back in the day. So Garrett came up with the idea based on a lot of great evidence, including reaction to A to XYZ, the old classic rock stunt of A to Z, putting your library in alphabetical order as a week-long event. They had huge reaction to that as an alternative station. And I think that plus some of the other tea leaves he was looking at pointed towards, why don't we broaden out the playlist? And we're seeing not just an alternative, but I'm sure you're seeing this too, that the contemporary radio stations around the U.S. in many cases are in some cases adapting and doing fine, but some of them are in some difficult times because younger audiences that they target are as into the old music as the older folks are. In fact, we used to see sometimes in classic rock that there would be kind of a donut hole, we called it demographically, in the middle of 2554, where there were some people that weren't so into the 70s, 80s classic rock, along with the 45 pluses, but the under 35s were into Led Zeppelin. So he's finding that to be the case with alternative. Now, in the true spirit of alternative, it is not a gold an entirely gold station. It's not a classic alternative, as some people sometimes refer to what they're doing. He's still playing some new music. He's choosing it very carefully, which probably makes him unpopular at times with his friends in the record business. But he's choosing the new music that really fits with that audience, that also enjoys hearing The Cure and Depeche Mode and a lot of Nirvana and Pearl Jam. It's working really, really well.
That's really fascinating. I've heard now from a few different people that the younger generations are bigger fans than ever of some gold library. I was actually talking to a friend of it's a DJ and does a lot of events, quinceañeras and bar mitzvahs and proms and so forth. And he said a lot of the kids, the young kids, the Z generation, want to hear songs from like the early 2000s, which is really kind of a trip because that music was like basically when they were born is what they want to hear, or even before they were born. And so I find that fascinating. I also find it very fascinating that vinyl continues to grow as a medium, nowhere near what it once was, but it continues to grow for the last several years.
It does. I think that old rule that we used to use as programmers that, all right, if our target audience begins at age 30, they graduated high school 12 years ago, and so we don't want to go back much farther than that.
Right.
It just doesn't apply anymore because you take classic rock as an example. The 25 to 54 end of the classic rock audience, almost all of that music came out either before they were born or certainly before their formative years musically. The internet has exposed all of that music to them. YouTube, streaming, their friends saying, hey, check out Led Zeppelin, check this out, check out that. The discovery process isn't something that results just from what's being marketed to people. Back in the day, there were the gatekeepers, be they record companies, program directors, music directors, who decided what their audience would be exposed to. They at least narrowed it down and let the audience decide from within that list what they liked and continue to play what they liked. But the power of the gatekeepers is greatly diminished because people can explore and find whatever they want.
Sure.
I think the other thing, though, is that there's a sentiment among especially that alternative audience that whatever is being marketed to me, and I don't just mean music, is evil. There's a knee-jerk reaction to not want to like what someone is spending money to ask you to like. And they tend to think that the music that predates their years is more genuine, authentic, and real because it predated marketing. And of course, it was marketed at the time.
Sure.
In different ways than maybe music is marketed today. But it was marketed at the time. They may or may not realize that, but it's not being marketed to them today.
That's
so they think it has more authenticity.
It's more organic, therefore. That's really interesting. I had not heard that. Yeah.
I find that a lot in the research when I did a ton of focus groups with the alternative audience and know kind of how that mind tends to think. We do the pizza in the conference room, poor man's focus groups on every market visit that I would do when I was consulting full time. And it really does teach you a lot about how that audience thinks. And sometimes it saves you from doing some really silly things. I remember one time a heritage alternative brand had a station attacking them with the brand name K-Rock. This was not in LA. But for the cost of a large pizza, we found out that core audience that would come to such a thing perceived the K-Rock brand as being from LA. And they resented that somebody had launched an LA radio station in their town. And you just went, oh my God, how much money is being wasted on the wrong brand name here? One pizza told us that was wrong. And so we just exploited that and they went away. They became Jack in 6 months. So it's amazing when you talk to your listeners what you can find out.
No, great advice. So tell me about one mentor. If you could pick one mentor, who would that person be? I know you've had several throughout your career. And what did they teach you?
Oh, it's so unfair to so many people. And then if you do a list, it's even worse when somebody gets left off, right? I worked for him for 12 years, and his brother Paul I will lump in. When I talk about Fred Jacobs, I'm talking about both of them, and their brother Bill is a good friend too. I'll say Jacobs. They taught me so much about everything, and how to manage up and down and get those ideas to be executed. Really, really smart people. And Greg Salk was so nice to bring me in LA, and he's a great person that I am very good friends with, and he's now, of course, at WXRT in Chicago. He was an executive at Bonneville when I worked with him. I'm going to stop there because there are too many others to mention. And
no, I know that's a tough one, and you've along your career path have gotten to work with a lot of phenomenal programmers, including now with Rick Cummings.
Yes.
What advice do you have for people that want to get into radio and what it holds here in the future?
Well, when I'm asked to talk to a radio class, let's say at a college, the way I always begin is by saying, how many of you would like to have a daily show where you could do your thing and talk to your friends and comment on what's going on in the world and all of that stuff? And a few hands will go up, a lot of them. The next question is, why aren't you doing it now? Because the barrier to entry with podcasting and audio in general is so low. And it could be that you and your friends in the garage or the basement are going to do something that only your friends in the garage and the basement and their girlfriends and boyfriends and an occasional parent will listen to. But that's okay, because that's what we used to do back in small town Nebraska or wherever. We did those shows every day, and it didn't matter as much there that there weren't that many people listening. We got to really explore the medium and what our own skills were, find our voices. So I encourage people to do that, whether they're employed or not. I do think that radio talent and the skills that are required, that's at such a turning point right now. It's probably a turning point comparable to when radio transitioned from 15, 30-minute dramas and block programming in the pre-TV days to recorded music-based programming for a lot of stations. I think the skills are going to be different going forward. It's comparable to if you look at movies way back before our time, when people made the transition from silent movies to the talkies.
Sure.
Some people made the transition and some people didn't. So to make that transition in audio, I would say it's about storytelling. It's about character development. It's about writing. It's a little different skill set than what it took to be an amicable host introducing some music on the radio. And I don't mean to talk down or diminish those skills, because that was a very important skill set for many years. But more so now, it's going to be about being able to tell great stories and be yourself.
You are an amazing storyteller, that is for sure. And I'm so grateful for this time that you've spent with us.
You're a great interviewer. I opened up to you like, it was like a Barbara Walters thing here or something. I just I rambled on and on and on. So
no, man,
you.
This was...
If somebody made it this far, they really need to email me and tell me. I would be amazed.
Dave, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been just a pure pleasure learning about you, and you've had just a gigantic impact on radio, and you're now having a gigantic impact on podcasting. And I'm grateful to be able to work with you and know you even more.
Chachi, thank you. It's so fun to work with you, and I'm honored that you took this time.
Thanks for listening to Chachi Loves Everybody. If you like the show, we hope you'll leave us a 5-star rating and tell your friends. Make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. This has been a Benztown podcast production, hosted and researched by Dave Chachi Dennis, executive producer Kevin Horton, produced and edited by Tom Green, show coordinator Juliana Parisi and Laura Keeney.